Welcome to our analysis of William Langewiesche's Inside an Angry Sky, presented to you by Mona Salah,
Duncan Phillips,
Rob DiPlacido.
This is a personal tale of Langewiesche's intentional flight through instrument meteorological conditions as he hunts bad weather, flying low and slow in simple aircraft to explore the inner reaches of the clouds. Langewiesche, accompanied by two other less experienced pilots in a single-engine Beechcraft Bonanza, not equipped with any anti-ice or de-icing measures, chased a storm that developed over the Pacific and that was forecasted to forge a path eastward across the North American continent during a period of 1 week. During this 1 week period, they interacted with various FBOs and forecasters and various weather conditions. Months after he completed this flight, he visited the National Weather Services Operations Center in Camp Springs, Maryland, where he discussed that flight's weather with a staff meteorologist. Here, many disconnects come to light. Here we have a topographical map of the United States. This map will be used to detail and show the paths of both the storm and Langewiesche's aircraft. A massive low had formed and developed into a storm over the Pacific. This storm made landfall on the northwest coast of California. Langewiesche and company started in California, where they contemplated heading north to Seattle towards the storm's center, where they would have the challenge of trying to avoid the icing conditions presented by the Cascade Mountains. These mountains also threatened to kill the very system that they intended to chase. Unsure as to the storm's forecast due to its passage over the mountains, they instead departed east at 200 miles per hour to Kansas City, Missouri, to explore a smaller disturbance that produced clouds, in order to reassess the map and contradictory meteorological forecasts. They hoped that their desired storm survived and caught up with them. This took all day. The weather in Kansas deteriorated to a point that it jeopardized the final stage of flight due to icing, low ceilings, and lack of fuel, but they were able to land safely with just a light frosting and plenty of fuel remaining. From Kansas City, they flew 500 miles northeast to South Bend, Indiana, where the weather was forecasted to be the worst, near blizzard conditions. The storm had regained strength and momentum after crossing the Cascade Mountains and encountering a cold air mass. After picking up icing, varying altitude, and planning an escape route back to Kansas City in the event of the weather worsening, they landed safely by utilizing an eyeless approach. The storm was tracking as forecasted to Indiana. By the afternoon of the same day, they flew from South Bend, Indiana to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania over the Alleghenies. Conditions remained dismal with visibility at 1/3 of a mile and persistent low ceilings, but with temperatures being too low to encounter icing conditions. Here, they landed on an icy runway and stayed the night. The storm was expected to track straight through to Massachusetts by morning. By morning, the storm had become quasi-stationary over the Mississippi River and extended a cold front southwest across Oklahoma and a stationary front eastward across the Virginias. This created extreme icing conditions which were reported to be in effect from the surface up to 16,000 feet. This grounded them due to the Bonanza being unequipped to handle ice, and made them have to alter their intended flight path from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania to New England. After waiting for a break from those conditions, they took off in harrowing freezing conditions and flew a winding path from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania to Richmond, Virginia via Wilmington, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., where they landed safely. After rethinking the storm and the previous flight, they flew a round trip to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, to re-encounter the weather while avoiding icing conditions. They landed back safely in Richmond, Virginia afterwards. The storm had now begun to move from its quasi-stationary position over the Mississippi River eastward towards West Virginia. This caused a slow-moving cold front to form from the Appalachians into the Gulf of Mexico. They took off from Richmond, Virginia to encounter and experience the storm at its worst. Here, they experienced large static charges and risked lightning strikes. After they touched down safely in Knoxville, Tennessee. The storm then continued through Nantucket and into the North Atlantic. Here they took off from Knoxville, Tennessee and flew to Orlando, Florida, following the storm's remnants of a front. After this flight, many months after, L went into the National Weather Service Operations Center to discuss and compare the weather from the storm as per the point of view of a pilot in the sky to that of the point of view of a forecaster on the ground.
Like many other topics relating to aviation, the discussion of the phenomenon of weather unveils many differing perspectives and opposing opinions and practices. This is especially the case when discussing the area of storm flying, which involves seeking out clouds and deep IMC conditions to be able to test your mettle and increase your technical flying skills. There are two opposing camps within the pilot group itself: those that are risk-averse and avoid any significant weather systems, and those that search for the experience within reasonable boundaries. Another faction that has a unique view of the weather is the forecasters, who aim to be able to scientifically predict weather patterns and formation. Often the viewpoint from the ground and that from the sky are at odds, and the gap is difficult to bridge. Pilots may not be able to communicate why one type of inclement weather or system is exciting or intimidating to the forecasters, who also might be interested in storms that meet completely different criteria. The views of meteorology are ever evolving, from the first weather manual, entitled Meteorologica, written by Aristotle in 340 BC, to many other narrations and tales centered around the experience of all types of weather. Langewiesche mentions his annoyance with the book Night Flight, which romanticizes the story of early French airmail pilots. His impatience with the glamorization of what is essentially bush flying springs from the constant fear of his early cargo flying days, when he was persistently confronted with stormy weather on his nighttime runs in what he considered a death ship. However, as his experience widens, he comes to appreciate the occasional harmony and beauty in that type of flying. He becomes among the converted pilots. Weatherwise reflects the continuing modern obsession with meteorology, which still remains largely enigmatic to both forecasters and pilots.
During the early stages of training for pilots, a fear of the weather is instilled in them. They are taught that it is easier and safer to avoid the weather and the inconveniences and dangers it presents. Sometimes this fear can be all-encompassing and makes pilots so risk-averse that regardless of the type or severity of the weather, weather is weather and they avoid it at all costs. This is encouraged because they aren't experienced enough to identify and discern which weather is flyable and that which is not. The general public, too, can be likened to the beginner pilot that typically has a very strong fear of flying when it comes to flying in anything but perfect, smooth, clear, and sunny weather. Too many bumps caused by turbulence and they begin to get unnerved. This kind of fear is reinforced by the media in the form of TV shows such as Why Planes Crash or articles in magazines.
Chaos in the sky. Brutal weather conditions causing aviation disasters.
It looked like a bomb went off.
A violent hailstorm shatters cockpit windshields and destroys a jet's engines.
It looked like it'd been beat with a hammer.
A powerful downdraft slams a 160-ton jet into rush hour traffic.
And the plane was coming over just like that, and I knew this can't be real.
And a vicious tailwind tosses a Airbus down a rain-slicked runway.
You could feel yourself almost leaving the seat of the airplane.
Ferocious storms can mean catastrophe in the skies.
I thought, Lord, I've never seen anything like this.
I didn't see how we weren't knocked right out of the sky.
Eyewitnesses and survivors tell their gripping stories. Dramatic animations put you up close and inside troubled planes as they battle the elements.
Trailblazers, we call them. Really, they are pilots and researchers pushing the flight envelope to new levels. These are the guys that find the biggest and baddest storms, such as hurricanes, and fly right into them to get to the eye of the storm. They are pioneers of storm chasing because they are entering a new frontier. They are deliberate risk takers to the highest degree, and all in the name of thrill and science. They gather data about different hurricanes and the weather associated with them, all in the hope of being able to sort out patterns in chaotic weather.
Level 180.
To get to the eye of the storm, we need to fly through the hurricane's eye wall, the most violent part.
Okay, so we got what, 12 miles to the wall here? We have 3 minutes. 3 minutes?
Once we're at altitude, we strap everything down and get ready to punch into the storm.
Well, we're about to go in. Secure all equipment. This one looks strong.
No matter how many times you do this, you always get a knot in your stomach just before you fly into the hurricane wall.
You don't need to worry about us. Adrenaline's pumping now. Okay, folks, seatbelt light is on. Here we go. Rock and roll. It's okay. It's just a little correction. Nice sharp wall. This ought to be good. Okay, wind speed. Yeah, got about 25-degree correction. Okay, airspeed 230. Okay, here we go. Okay, steady. Oh, good one. Tickle your gizzard. All right. Good one.
After being tossed around by 120-mile-an-hour winds, the moment you break in the eye is just incredible. It's just so peaceful.
As a point of clarification, we have the storm chasers that we're calling trailblazers and the storm flyers. Storm chasers are the riskiest of all forms of pilots because they fly right into the heart of the storm and through its worst effects. However, storm flyers, as seen by Langewiesche's own flight path, shows what a storm flyer does. They are pilots who also seek storms to fly within, but do so with due consideration to the more limited capabilities of their airplanes, as shown in Langewiesche's flight path and the storm's track. Note that the flight path skirts the storm without ever entering its most devastating effects. Langewiesche's narrative reflects a position between the trailblazers and the fearful flyers. However, he also acts as a mentor for those that began in his initial situation, weighed down by dread, and who would like to push their personal limits to expand their comfort zone. He bridges that gap, helping those less experienced hone their technical flying skills as well as the softer competencies required for flying, including being able to feel the airplane and predict its behavior as well as their own in an infinite number of varying circumstances. It's important to reiterate that this is not achieved in any careless, fatalistic, or overly reckless manner. From an interview regarding storm flying, when asked what kinds of systems he will not approach, Langewiesche is quoted as saying,
"It depends very much on the type of airplane involved. It's extremely rare for us not to get through to a destination, but it does happen. I do retreat. You never, ever go into a situation where you don't have an out and an out for that out. It's not thrill-seeking. It's a very technical training exercise that's a real bonding experience for the pilots you go with."
Obviously, careful and detailed planning between the pilots involved is required, as well as open communication about their roles in emergency scenarios and decision-making regarding each emergent event as their flight unfolds. In some circumstances, the level of focus and intensity of concentration required precludes any outward speech, but being familiar with your crews and your airplane's rhythms may be all the communication required in that situation. This reenactment and narration of one of this trip's typical takeoff and flight into IMC illustrates the atmosphere and dynamic within the confines of the cockpit.
We took off and were swallowed by a cloud. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The ground vanished so quickly that it might never have existed. Indiana became an abstraction, South Bend an uncertain memory. The clouds were rough, but it was the psychological severity of this transition from the ground to the weather that made the airplane difficult to control. I asked the pilot beside me at the controls to stop throwing switches, to stop writing down frequencies and fuel settings, to stop listening to the Morse identifiers of the navigational stations, and please, simply to concentrate on flying. A good pilot is one who knows when not to follow procedures. Ice can also become an obsession. Once you start looking for it, you see it all around.
Bad weather is subjective to its observer. There is a commonality in inclement weather that everyone can agree on, such as high winds, damaging or disruptive precipitation, turbulence, and overcast skies. Oftentimes, though, bad weather is subject to its interpreter. In our PPL training, we can identify with the divide between an inexperienced student's definition of bad weather against an instructor's. There is also a general divide between forecasters and pilots' interpretation of foul weather. Langewiesche summarizes it when he says,
Weather watchers are drawn to history's most violent weather, but pilots are drawn to the weather they have flown.
The real division lies in the fact that forecasters try to understand the weather from the outside, something we call the ground perspective. Conversely, we have pilots who are trying to understand the weather from within, known informally as the air perspective. The following video will help illustrate how perspectives can change. It is a clip of an Airbus breaking through IMC conditions on approach into milder conditions. It shows the air perspective and how it can be completely different from the ground.
Minimum. $120, 100. 50, 40, 30, 20, retard, 9, 5.
The division between pilots and forecasters is not limited to their subjective take on weather, but extends into a science versus art comparison. Forecasters are interested in the scientific aspect of weather, recognizing patterns and being able to accurately predict the weather. This leaves them in a very public pursuit of science, whereas a storm flyer is interested in mastering their art of flying through severe weather. It is an internal pursuit within the privacy of a cockpit. Forecasters have the misfortune of being subject to a very public science that is limited by chaos theory. Chaos theory, summarized by Edward Lorenz, and explains dynamic systems that are extremely sensitive to initial conditions and result in changes to the system. It is also known as the butterfly effect. The initial conditions are similar, but end up resulting in a completely random and different process than before. Edward Lorenz proved that weather is chaotic, and therefore extremely inaccurate when predicted beyond a 5-day period. But he recognized that even though weather is chaotic, patterns exist. Forecasters, through experience, seek to find these patterns and use them to predict forecasts for the public. Langewiesche also pursues his storm flying to recognize patterns, not in weather like forecasters, but in hopes of being able to predict his own actions or reactions and the aircraft's performance in storms. We can easily classify pilots into 3 groups. There are pilots who know their limits and stay within them. There are pilots who become progressively more cautious, as Langewiesche says.
And there is also such a thing as being too careful. If you give in to your fears, if you don't push gently against them, you will turn around too soon. And the next time you fly, you will turn around sooner. Eventually, you will turn around before takeoff, which is an unhappy fate of some pilots, to choose finally never to fly again.
Well said, Langewiesche. A terrible misfortune for any pilot. This brings us to the final type of pilot, and those are pilots like Langewiesche who push gently against their limits and aim to be better. Most times, the conservative pilots accuse storm flyers, who are those that push gently past their limits, of recklessness, and to the uninformed this may seem true. Langewiesche quickly clears this up by saying,
because of the mental concentration required by such flying, there is never the slightest question of survival. In fact, it is such a discipline that gives the exercise its content.
Langewiesche shows the importance of communication in his endeavor. First of all, the 3 pilots are each given their tasks, and Langewiesche emphasizes how he always has retreats in case of an issue, and retreats from even those retreats. It's about being prepared, and in the event something changes, being prepared for that already as well. Langewiesche details in an interview how what other pilots call recklessness is mitigated in his storm flying. He says,
we wait for a big low-pressure system to form, and it takes about 5 days to track that system from the west to the east. It doesn't mean we just fly to the center of the low every time, or fly to where the weather is worst. If you did that, you'd wind up dying very fast.
The communication aspect is crucial to all successful endings of a flight. Langewiesche says,
it's in how you talk. It's in the code words. It's in the jokes you tell.
It's in being tactful in the language you use and obtaining the right information and knowing how to use it.
So what can we take away from this in the different types of pilots? All of them have a unilateral fear of icing, for one. Icing on any aircraft, no matter the type, poses a great threat. As even Langewiesche says, with ice, there are all kinds of subtleties and unknowns from airplane to airplane, and from one icing encounter to another. Ice is scary stuff, and it will kill you. Icing occurs when water, either as supercooled droplets or as rain falling from warmer air into colder air below, strikes an aircraft in flight. Generally, it is encountered while operating through clouds, which is comprised of suspended water droplets. Ice has an affinity for developing on the thinnest of surfaces first, and then on larger ones. As ice builds up across these lifting surfaces, it disturbs the airflow over them. This disruption inhibits the aircraft's ability to produce the lift required to keep it airborne, and this effect becomes more pronounced as more and more ice builds and weight is added to the aircraft. Eventually, the aircraft will stop flying and start descending towards the ground, unable to keep generating the forces required to stay aloft. But icing does not only pose a physical threat, it also poses a psychological one as well. There are means to prevent or dislodge ice from aircraft, but these are not absolute forms of protection. This is why, amongst all types of pilots, the fear of icing is both a healthy and rational emotion, but it can become an obsession. An obsession that, if unchecked, results in the perception of seeing ice everywhere, from in-flight to aircraft simply parked on the ground. Secondly, pattern recognition is also key amongst them. It is key because regardless of the situation involved, these three types of pilots are always looking for patterns in their own way and for their own purposes. Whether they avoid weather like the unexperienced, completely dive headfirst like the trailblazers, or skirt danger and gently push limits like the experienced, they seek out any subtleties that will help them to understand their own pattern of personal reaction or actions and that of their aircraft's performance. Weather forecasters, as well, seek out patterns, but those are not patterns within themselves, but with that of weather. They only seek to find patterns within the weather to better be able to tell where and what it will do. These patterns, like storms, are invariably different from one another, so are the reasons for their recognition. Finally, all share a healthy respect of what weather is capable of. Langewiesche, when facing the resulting weather created by the storm that they were chasing, said, "It would be ridiculous to say that we were not then afraid. The sky had gathered around us in a malicious display of its power." Langewiesche, who is an experienced one, acknowledges that weather is not a force to be trifled with, but deserves the utmost respect, since he admits to fearing the very same weather that he desires to chase. This respect and acknowledgement is why more conservative pilots will steer clear of inclement weather at all costs, and why the trailblazers will always go into such weather fully prepared and equipped to expect the unexpected.
You can remember it's like, it's glass over top, right? It's been spray.
Be like HD, you'd be like pick out our pimples on our face. I feel like I'm taking off that one. In the intro, and we're like, well, the article was like, we need some blooper reel footage.
Is this a dater? Because I'm not dating her if she has a bald head.
Perfect. That's perfect.
You want to come join the discussion?
Oh, that's what that was. You have another ladybug there.
They're taking over the place.
Take 479.